So Suzanne is a queer advocate, provocateur, interdisciplinary artist, lecturer and environmental justice and anti-oppression trainer. And we had a very interesting discussion last night because she trained on the social practice course at Oxford Brookes. And there's a huge debate about Joseph Beuys that sort of emerged there, which I'm sure we might sort of return to in the day. So I think Susan will explore how surviving into the future as a queer woman of colour means imagining and birthing ecological justice movements outside the colonial, non-profit industrial complex. And I should just hopefully press slideshow and we don't have problems with that. Forward.
Just move it slightly.
It's gone. Are you okay with that, Susan?
Yeah,
Sorry, it's
fine.
on presenting. Maybe I can do that and then another to that.
Hi everyone. Can you just theme just about?
It picks up.
Does it?
Just-
Okay,
picks
just
up fine,
project.
Just project.
Okay, great. Hi, so my name is Suzanne Dhaliwal, and I just wanted to bring my full name into the room just to honour my ancestors, both future and past. And actually my middle name means peaceful warrior, and so I think that's just something that I wanted to bring there because my identity definitely plays a really crucial role in my perspective as being an environmentalist. I was born in Birmingham, but I moved to Canada, so I exist both as someone of colour living in Brexit Britain with increasing fascism, but also when I'm in Canada, I'm a settler colonialist because my family, who are Sikh, settled in Canada. So I move between this identity of both being a coloniser and being colonised as well. So I just wanted to bring that into the room because that's really important in terms of how I've been working and how that frames my work. I actually come from a background of philosophy, and then I sort of accidentally fell into working at Médecins Sans Frontières after the tsunami hit. And when I was there, I started to learn more and more about what's considered the fourth world, which is indigenous communities. And so indigenous communities, and I just have to say I'm not indigenous, I do not speak on behalf of any indigenous people. I speak as an ally, I speak in solidarity, and as much as possible I try and bring those voices into the space. And so my work has been more at the intersection of extractivism and indigenous communities, and so that means that a lot of the violence that's been happening against the earth is what's been happening against indigenous people. So I actually didn't come to this as a climate activist. That's something that emerged later on. And so actually it's quite not funny, but when I lived in Canada, I didn't know about the Canadian tar sands. And how many people know about it? Yeah. Oh wow, yay. And so when I was living in Canada and growing up and being a privileged settler colonialist, it was not known about. The Canadian government tried to move forward with this project. It's been going on for 50 years, the Canadian tar sands. So when we're thinking about temporality, I think we also need to think about climate change isn't some future scenario. It's a continuation of colonialism, which started with the beginning of patricide and the conquering of what was the Americas. And so I think that's really important for us to zoom out and to have that concept of time when we're thinking about colonisation, when we're thinking about climate change, because in the last 18 months, people have made it sort of feel like, oh, climate change is this new thing, it's just happened. But so I really want us to sort of ground ourselves in that temporality of like we are coming into a movement that has been going on since 1492 and before. So that's just something that I wanted to bring there. So actually I left Canada because in 2009, when I was working at Médecins Sans Frontières, I wasn't able to talk about climate change. We couldn't talk about it. It was like seen as a conspiracy theory. It was also something they didn't want to deal with. No, we just do development, we do aid, we don't do that, which is very interesting now. Médecins Sans Frontières is talking about it. And being in Canada, I used to work in this office and I would walk outside and you'd see indigenous communities on the street. and yet there was this resistance in Canada to actually talk about the colonialism and the genocide, this slow industrial and intentional genocide of Indigenous communities. So what is happening to the land in Canada, this extraction for tar sands oil, is a, like I said, it's a continuation of that project, the genocidal project of white supremacy. And so the scale of this project is that now the planned projects would comprise the size of England and Wales. It's the second largest rate of deforestation globally. Like, we often think about the Amazon, but the boreal forests in Canada, they're often called, the lungs of the planet. So while we're mindful of what is happening in the Amazon, we need to also start to pay attention to what is happening in the boreal. It's not quite as sexy as the Amazon, so it doesn't get as much attention, but it is a vital carbon sink that is at play there. So as I said, the amount of devastation that has already happened there, like, this used to be pristine boreal forest, and also home to multiple Indigenous First Nations. However, the Canadian foreign ministers will often say no one lives up there, or it's just a few people. And that is why the issue didn't reach a lot of attention back until recently. So I just wanted to, again, really get that image into your mind. Like, you can fly over this for about half an hour and you won't see the end of it. There's toxic tailing ponds, lakes, that, birds land on them, they die instantly, bears, caribou, all wildlife. There's been no comprehensive analysis of the cumulative impacts of all of the tar sands project, which is scary given that every global oil corporation is going in there. And so, once we reached peak oil in around 2009, instead of switching to renewables, what actually happened was that we switched to unconventional oil. That's what the oil industry switched to. So this is tar sands oil, and I'll just tell you a little bit about the process. Whereas conventional oil kind of tends to, comes up, just like the old images of spewing out of the ground. To get unconventional oil out of the ground, you have to deforest. Industry calls that overburden. So remove the overburden, and they actually roll it up. It's crazy, and put it into storage containers. And the idea, and what industry is saying, is that they can reclaim it. I don't think you can reclaim a boreal forest. I don't think they're that good designers. And also, the other thing is that you cannot, for people who have lived on that land since time immemorial, for Indigenous communities, when you kill the land, you are essentially committing genocide. You are removing the cultural significance, and as well as the physical subsistence of being able to be there. So what was happening with the tar sands was that the community in Fort Chipewyan, which is a northern flying community, they were starting to experience rare autoimmune diseases, cancers, tumours, lesions in the traditional foods. And once the traditional foods become contaminated, that's a slippery slope towards that genocide again. So the Canadian government was refusing to look at the health impacts. The Canadian population, because of the ongoing racism towards Indigenous people, was being ignored. And so I was actually working at Survival International when I came back to the UK, and I was just on the internet and I saw these pictures, and I just was like, I cannot believe this is happening. And I really tried to get Survival International to do a campaign on this, and their response to me was that it's too late for those Indigenous people, and they don't fit with our brand because they're not loincloth, guardian, Indigenous people. And so, as what I did in response to that was like, well, I can't not work on this now. And so I actually was forcibly removed from Survival International because I refused to stop talking about the tar sands and wouldn't stop talking about the racism towards Indigenous people there. But there's a happy story to this. I was really lucky to meet some organisers from the Alberta Tar Sands and the Indigenous Environmental Network, which is an amazing organisation that you should look up. And in 2009, what happened was we decided that we would use our privilege and our power of being in the London Square Mile to amplify what was happening back in Canada. And so we started a campaign, and the first actions that we did were with the climate camp. in 2009. And some of those actions, we were outside BP, and we were talking about what was happening with the tar sands, and it went all over the news in Canada. And we were just like, okay, there's something to this. There's something to this power of using the Guardian and the media, however annoying they all are, to create an international story. So that had amazing implications back for the community on the ground, and also in Canada, to get the Canadian public to even know that the tar sands was happening. As I said, it was completely going under the radar. We actually designed this logo in the climate camp, in the dark, with torches, with one of the teachers, so one of the chiefs of the Fort Chipewyan First Nation, and he was really adamant that the centre drop would be red and not black, because it's their blood, it's blood oil, and that was very important to what he did. So like I said, I spent most of like a decade on the steps of the Canadian Embassy, Canada House in London, and we were constantly there, sometimes 3 or 4 actions a month, and all of the actions, and this is something that I really want to stress, is about the culture of organising. So some of these actions might look like some of the actions that we're seeing coming out of Extinction Rebellion or that, but I want to talk about this a deeper ethos of solidarity that was woven into a lot of that work that we did. So every direct action that we did, every press release, every strategy, always went back to the chief, it always went back to the community, because we're not the ones who are going to get the implications of those interventions. For instance, when the oil industry found out the chief of the First Nations had gone outside of BP and that he was talking to the press, you know, the next day helicopters landed on his house and were removed contracts that they had with the oil industry, because it's not straightforward. It's not like Indigenous people aren't engaged with the oil industry. You know, economic, they've been pushed to that economic place where they are also dependent on the oil industry and working there. So we had to make sure that strategically, which means my sleep patterns are off because I'm always on Skype late at night, putting in that extra mile of doing that consultation, every press release, every element of the communication strategy has to be designed with the community. And so, as you know, as well as having this sort of power with the media, we also have a power and a colonial responsibility in the UK, because a lot of the financing and the corporate power is coming from here. And I know, again, a lot of this is maybe the flavours of activism that we've been seeing lately, but I wanted to bring this movement, her story, to the forefront so that we can understand about how some of this divestment work has been working in the past with a decolonial perspective. So this is the Royal Bank of Scotland, and we were doing some hijinks outside their AGM. And so we would use a lot of stunts and a lot of theatrics to bring attention to the AGMs, of course to get press, but also the primary aim was always to get Indigenous voices into the AGMs, because we're not just asking RBS to not invest in the tar sands, we were pushing for changes in financial policy. And I think that's a really important dilution of the divestment movement that's happened with groups like 350.org, is that we're not just asking for individual project stoppages, like it's not just the Standing Rock or the Keystone XL pipeline. We have to be pushing for shifts in financial policy. So with Royal Bank of Scotland, we were pushing for the Equator Principles to be adopted, which means any project that doesn't have the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous communities is actually illegal. So these are mainly illegal projects because they have not gone through the proper consent process. So you have to remember that Indigenous First Nations, they're not like me, I'm not a BME within England. Indigenous First Nations are sovereign nations, so they have a state-to-state relationship. So the consultation process has to happen there. So because that's not happening, Canada is violating international protocol, they're violating the Equator Principles, and also it just doesn't look good on your brand that you are investing in all of these. So when we went into the AGMs, we went every year to the Royal Bank of Scotland AGM, and also because they were state-owned at the time, we thought it was a really good tactic. We worked really closely with Climate Camp, with support there to hold these actions and to do it in solidarity. And there was a lot of conversations and a lot of tensions around that relationship as well. Because I remember we were camped outside the Royal Bank of Scotland, and at one point some people were like, "Oh, let's just like get hectic," and like some people wanted to like throw rocks through the windows of Royal Bank of Scotland, and we had to be like, we can't do that if we've got Indigenous communities here, because they're the ones who are going to face the consequences back home, their reputation. That's okay if we're going to do that, but then we can't be associated with the camp. So there's a lot of questions about when you're doing solidarity and when you are centering frontline voices about how you're willing to work within your anarchism, which is decolonized, which still has accountability, which still has responsibility as well. And then the last thing with Royal Bank of Scotland is that as well as the human rights angle, the FPIC, free, prior, informed consent angle, the violations that they were committing against the UNDRIC, the United Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, we also then moved into working in the insurance industry as well. Because if you should really look into the insurance industry, because they have acknowledged climate change since the 1970s. So they're really a community that has been open to understanding the risks involved with projects such as this, and also working towards a reality of the climate bubble being about to pop. And so we've started there with coal, because coal was a low-hanging fruit, and we managed to push Lloyd's of England to no longer provide project financing. So if you think about it, it's another step underneath divestment. If you can't get insurance, you can't get a loan for your project. So targeting the insurance industry, and there's a great campaign called On Frank Coal, and they have been working to continually set this trend amongst insurers that investing in heavy oil, not only because of the climate impacts, but also the human rights impacts. And I think that's something to understand, is that the brand damage is very important, and also exposing that these companies shouldn't have the social license to operate. And so some of the companies that we targeted, BP and Shell, and we work really closely in a coalition and alongside Art Not Oil to do these actions that would sort of amplify what we were doing inside the AGMs in the press as well, because the AGMs are so boring. Like, people just go there for the free sandwiches. Literally, it's full of pensioners going for free sandwiches. And so it's like a free theatre. And that's the way to think of it. It was like a theatre space. So we would buy shares. I remember sitting in a pub with my stockbroker, like trying to buy shares up so we could get as many people into the AGMs. This was back in 2009. So that we could fill up the seats, to ask the pointed questions, to ask, are you thinking about climate risk? And kind of to embarrass them to their big investors like BlackRock as well. So it was definitely a sort of a theatrical performance, and we worked very much in a coalition. Sometimes Rising Tide would be shutting down a petrol station in London, we would be in the AGM, and we would act like we don't even know them, I don't know what they're doing, and while we would be inside the AGM, working with pension funds to make the moral argument and the financial argument that BP and Shell need to divest from the tar sands. So since then, BP has divested from the tar sands, from one of their projects, but it's a little bit of a bittersweet thing, because the chief said to me, he's like, that's great, so you've got BP out, now what are we going to do with jobs? How are we going to clean this up? How are we going to revive the economy? So I think that's a big conversation that we need to have as we're divesting. What is the reinvestment strategy? What is the clean-up strategy? And how are we building, not just trying to stop single projects, but to shift the financial industry and corporations themselves. So again, this is another action that we did in the wake of the BP Gulf disaster. What happened was that the work that we'd been doing in the tar sands and this model of organising, which was very much about being in service, in solidarity, and using our proximity to BP and Shell to amplify what was happening there. And with this action, actually I was on the MA at the time, and that image that you saw at the beginning where I'm holding that megaphone to my ear, I really went deep into that practice of, before you get on your megaphone and you have a shout, have you listened? Have you listened to the community? Have you stopped in your tracks? And there's a humility to taking that step back and to understand that there are environmental justice leaders, walking encyclopedias who have been living and breathing this work. So I help the students just sort of slow down the process of the action. So we had Skype calls with the community in New Orleans, with the Fisher people, to build those relationships so it wouldn't just be a flash in the pan action, and also to talk to them and to understand, what is the imagery that you're feeling? How do you want to be represented? What kind of dignity, the tone, all of those design questions are a way to enact that solidarity and bring it into the form. So that was something that we spent time with, which can be very difficult because when you are in this emergency reaction, the impulse can be like, right, just pull off the bed sheet, paint it and go. But what if we slow it down and build the solidarity into the design process? And then, we tried to also make sure that we were keeping the eyes and imaginations on this issue between sort of crisis situations. And so we commissioned these hats. I love that one, I brought to yours. And these were commissioned for Kate Middleton when she went to Alberta, Canada. And she was travelling through Alberta, but she didn't go to the tar sands, and she didn't acknowledge what was happening there. So we sent her these, and we actually, there's 10 of them, and we actually managed to get a story in Grazia, and we had banner ads in Grazia. So for us, and that was a way of reaching, there's a huge demographic of women who are online, on your lunch break, shopping in Grazia. And so we were able to reach a whole new audience of people. We paid for banner ads, and it just did that thing of reaching people who maybe weren't intrigued by the stories, but they saw this picture. So people in different creative ways, different modes, and maybe even like publications and mainstream culture that we don't normally engage in, but how can we intervene into that? And then this is another action that we did with felt artist Lucy Sparrow, who actually got really famous after this. She made a whole sex shop out of felt, and she's a felt artist. And again, it was that idea of how can we break out of just working with activists, and how can we bring the felt impacts of what is happening in the tar sands to the animals. And she made these animals that have like tumours, and again we designed all of the animals, all of that with our Indigenous friends on Skype. We wanted to make sure that they were sensitive, and also we took time to research the traditional foods and the traditional fishes. And this particular campaign was around the fact that a lot of this oil is actually coming to Europe through Valero in Wales as a refinery. There were plans to bring a lot of tar sands there. But what happened was the EU actually came together to try and create a fuel quality directive, which would essentially ban tar sands oil from coming into Europe. But at the time, Canada and Europe were negotiating a trade agreement. So basically, the UK government was working with Canada to try and block this legislation. And so, we were like, how are we going to get people to care about a really boring piece of EU transport legislation? And so that was why we sort of, did these creative interventions. We actually rolled out, it was like a whole scene outside of the steps of Canada House, and it had this glitter, and it was sparkling. And we also created like evenings where people could come and sew, and that meant that people who don't necessarily don't want to engage with police, who don't have the right to stay in the UK, don't want to be involved that kind of direction, but still want to be part of it and are still a part of the community, could come and sew, and they could come and participate in that way. And again, it did really well in terms of like getting this really boring transport legislation into the press. And then this is outside the Chalet GM as well, and this is Monique Beredin. She's a filmmaker. There's an amazing film called My Louisiana Love, which you should watch. It's just amazing. And so, as I said, as we did this work, our environmental justice community just started growing because the tar sands, although it's in Canada, it's been shipped down to the Gulf, as far down as Venezuela. The plan is once the Arctic melts to take it across to Russia and to China. So it's like a really far-reaching community and network that we worked with. So this was in The Hague, outside the Chalet GM. And you know, we actually struggled to find any funding or any money to respond when there was a Shell oil spill in the Gulf. It wasn't getting in the press or anything, so we had to be really resourceful and just think about what can we do. So we used Monique's pop-up exhibition that she travels with, and we took that outside. We pulled our own money, and a lot of this stuff that happens, because it's often responsive, it's coming from a decolonial perspective, it can often be really hard to fund it and support it. So that's something about, like, well, if I think about how I'm an artist, how am I creative, like how you would make magic happen out of nothing. So that's really a question of resources and access, and seeing the amount of resources that we've seen in the movement recently, it's been very shocking. And so how can we redistribute those resources and have that self-reflection to bring these essential voices in as well. And recently there was another great intervention at the Chalet GM a few weeks ago as well, and I think it's very important to go into those spaces. One, because it's just fascinating that, you know, these corporations become these big monsters in your mind, and when you see them, it's like, wow, you stiff 12 old white men are deciding the future for the planet. It really is empowering to understand that how we can take back the power to disrupt those spaces, to have those conversations. And again, it's a free theatre to get your message out, to address the financial press, to address investors. And as you can get a proxy. You can see more about that if you want details on how to get in. Yeah. And so, yeah, so this, the reason I've been talking about all these past actions is because I just wanted to bring up where we are at in the climate movement at the moment. And it's been a shocking few months, I think, for a lot of us who have been doing this work, who have been working in these spaces, that a lot of us have been erased in the climate movement as it's emerged at the moment. So I've been writing about white supremacy in the environmental movement for a long time, and I think these questions have come to the forefront given the way that Extinction Rebellion has unfolded in terms of engagement with the police, making room for communities of colour. And so diversity versus decolonising means that we need to move our movements from a space where it's not add colour and stir. So you don't come up with the idea and then stir us in and sprinkle us on the top. But decolonising that movement means that from the inception, from the design of your actions, from the creation of the community that is organising and the distribution of resources, that is centering first Indigenous communities, because even though Indigenous people only make up 4% of the global population, they are protecting 80% of the remaining diversity. The UN has acknowledged this now. And so if we're thinking about strategies and if we're thinking about solutions, becoming an ally in solidarity with Indigenous people isn't just the right thing to look woke, it's the thing to do to actually protect remaining intact ecosystems. And also Indigenous communities have millennia of experience with traditional ecological knowledge, but also contemporary ecological knowledge, and how we can bring these strategies moving forward. So that's the decolonisation, it's the humility, it's the stripping back the white supremacy of thinking of rationalism that only white middle class people can solve this problem, because you can't fix a problem with the mentality that created it. So if the source of this problem is white supremacy, it's capitalism, it's seeing nature as being to hand, it's seeing it as a commodity, then we need to also go through that transformation in ourselves, which means stopping and doing that power and privilege work, looking at our identity, and not to feel bad for being a white middle class person, some of my best friends are, but to step into your power because, you know, for me, as I said, like, I could feel quite disempowered in Britain right now, but I understand my relative power in relationship to my relatives in Rajasthan right now who are going through the heat wave. I understand that my privilege in relationship to Indigenous women. There's a huge epidemic of violence against Indigenous women in Canada at the moment. And so, you know, situating yourself in that, really doing that power work and that internal shifting both unlocks power for you and understands where to position yourself in the movement. And it kind of gives you a bit of a break because people have been doing this for a long time. So you've got lots of inspiration to move into that. And so I just wanted to, what's my time? 15? Yeah. So that's why I just wanted to bring up this notion of environmental justice. And that term has become a little bit bastardized in the last little while. And I think that we need to really go back to the core of that and understanding that. And this is a picture, there's me, tiny. This is a picture from the climate march that happened just before Paris. And what happened with this climate march was that actually we had the police set on us by some of the NGOs who were running this march because we wanted to talk about colonialism, because they had promised that we could lead the march because we're impacted by climate change, so we should be the first. And we're the first impacted by it, so we should be the first to lead. So there were NGOs that were involved there with physically removing us and physically that violence towards us that we experience from the non-profit industrial complex. So I think that moment was a turning point in terms of you know, trying to understand, well, how do we build an environmental justice movement in the UK, and where does the non-profit industrial complex stand in this? We actually had to close the no tar sands after 10 years because Greenpeace actually stole our campaign. They mimicked it, they stole the branding, they stole the imagery, the strategies, and as a small grassroots organisation, you know, once media and the representation gets you your funding, and so we were going to actually take Greenpeace to court. That seemed absurd. So we settled out of court with them. But that's what I want to bring into the room about this reality of the non-profit industrial complex. And it's not about individuals in those organisations, there's well-meaning individuals. It's the complex itself. Because the non-profit industrial complex, it doesn't necessarily work by solving the problems. Because if you think about it, if they solve the problem, that organisation doesn't necessarily puts itself out of business. So there can be a resistance to go to the root causes of those problems, and traditionally the hires in those spaces are white middle class, coming from Oxford, MSc in environment and energy. If you go to the right parties, do right MDMA with the right people, it's very much a subculture. And I was part of that subculture. I wasn't doing MDMA, but I was part of that subculture for a long time. And then I started to think, why aren't there any people who look like me? Why aren't you listening to me when I say we need to have conversations about diversity of tactics and what is the longevity and the commitment to me, especially as a woman of colour now in these times that we're in now, to actually respect and respond to me? And where is the intersection of environmental justice in this? So I think these are questions that have got really reactivated by what's been happening with Extinction Rebellion and some of the critiques and questions coming out of that. So I just wanted to bring another amazing ancestor of the environmental justice movement into the room, and that is Ken Saro-Wiwa. And I think it's about this pausing and stopping before we race ahead and understand that, in Nigeria, these apocalyptic landscapes that you're imagining for your future, they exist. This thing that you're thinking is going to happen to you, so bringing ourselves into a spatial temporal reality, that's already happening on the ground right now. So an amazing text that I would recommend is the Ogoni Bill of Rights. The Ogoni Bill of Rights actually is one of the seminal texts where Ken makes the explicit link between the rights of Indigenous people and how those rights are connected to their environmental rights, and they're interlinked. And it's a beautiful text. And the other thing I love about what Ken did was that he was such a popular he loved pop culture. He actually wrote a soap opera, kind of like the EastEnders of Nigeria. And so he was constantly bringing these questions around identity, around Ogoni identity to the forefront, and as you can see, to the point where, you know, eventually Ken and the Ogoni Nine were killed in collaboration with Shell, and that court case is currently in The Hague. So I'd encourage you to look at that court case and ways that that's playing out. And so this is an intervention that I did. I was really humbled to work with Platform and Mossa, which is the movement for the Ogoni people. And we actually, this truck was made by Sakari Douglas Camp, and she's a Nigerian British artist. And she, inside it is a cinema, there's the name of the Ogoni Nine on the top. And she built this, and the community in Nigeria said they wanted it to come home to Ken's hometown for the 20th year anniversary of his death. And so, like, okay, let's get it on a ship and send it over there. And it actually fell in the dock, in the water, and we had to get it out again. Shell. And so we actually then, we did manage to get it to Nigeria. And then what happened was that the colonel who was involved in the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa happened to be the head of customs at that time. So he seized the bus. No one's ever seen the bus again, but what we did is we used that intervention to get international press about what was happening with Shell, with cleanup. It also became this tool where the community in Nigeria could say, oh, we want to meet about the bus, but really they wanted to meet about the oil cleanup. So I think that's a really beautiful example of like solidarity and action, and even that the sculpture in its invisibility has had such an impact as well. And so for me, it's just the way that the work has unfolded, that these relationships between Arctic, Nigeria, the Canadian Delta, there's this interweaving of these threads of environmental justice work. So we often try and make sure that we know when we do go to the Shell AGM, we have people from Ireland, Rossport, bringing those coalitions together, because when you bring Indigenous communities together as well and you hear those same stories of environmental resistance, there's a power and there's a community building. And so sometimes that stuff can feel like the soft stuff that you add on after, but for me that is the work, those are the invisible materials of relationship that we need to build, because this isn't just a flash in the pan. We're going to be doing this probably the rest of our lives. And so, yeah, this is just another image of how, so as well as doing direct action, a lot of my work is about the communication strategies. And so this was during Paris, and we had and as many of you know, there was a state of emergency after the terrorist attack in Paris. And a lot of the community members felt that they still needed to go, and so they actually brought a canoe from the Amazon, all the way from the Amazon, that came to the Seine, and we had a flotilla of communities who took that down the Seine. So it was really important to both be there for Indigenous communities, but also there were a lot of ceremonies for the people of Paris as well, to show that solidarity. And I think that's something for me that often gets lost in the parts per million and those graphs. It's like the humanity, the connection, the relationship. And as we know, the COP itself was a complete faff and not worth the paper it's written on. And a lot of that was because of the fact, for us, there was no human rights written into the Paris Agreement, and the Indigenous rights were not, there's no legally binding Indigenous rights in the Paris Agreement. And we know why, because if there was Indigenous rights in it, it would stop all these ecocidal plans. And so, there is now an Indigenous peoples platform, which is part of the Paris Agreement, but it's non-binding. But it is an instrument, and that can be used and amplified to support and to centre Indigenous perspectives in terms of that process. And so, as I mentioned, a lot of the work that we do now, or the way that we were weaving into it, was to make sure that the work was intersectional. And that word gets so misused as well. So what do I mean by intersectionality? So, that the oppressions that we face are cumulative. So, obviously, as a queer, as a queer Black, Indigenous people face the largest amounts of oppression. And so that means they have to be at the centre of our movement. So that's recentering automatically to shift that power balance. And so we did a lot of relationship building to try, and this was during Standing Rock. So when Standing Rock happened, we did some divestment actions, but we also worked with Sisters Uncut as well, because we wanted to pull out those relationships. You know, the violence that is happening in London to women, that is the same violence that is happening on the land. And so bringing people into it from a solidarity perspective, from understanding how those relationships connect. And then most recently I was helping on working on this podcast, Mothers of Invention, and it's with Mary Robinson, and the goal there was to, again, like, how do we pull out and understand how climate change impacts women first. And obviously it's gendered in terms of, you know, the sexual violence that happens at the site of extraction camps. So for instance, you know, with extraction comes man camps, which comes rape and high levels of murder as well. Just a few days ago, it was actually in the news that the violence against Indigenous women in Canada is now being called a genocide. And so we have to constantly understand how women are impacted first, and not just in a victim way, but it's because we're also on the forefront of the solutions, of the strategies, because our existence right now on the earth is a complete act of resistance. So I think that's, in terms of the work that often comes into curatorial decisions, so who speaks at your marches, whose voices are being answered, and I think the podcast, you know, it reached a white middle class female audience. That was our target, to start to get white feminists to also recenter women of colour, Indigenous women of colour, because often that is a tension that we face there again, and that's a work that we have to do together of also decolonising and unpatriarching our feminist movements. I just made that phrase up. Yeah, so as I said, like, now a lot of the work that I've been doing is that I actually don't want a lot of the young women of colour who are coming into our environmental movements to go through the decade of racism and anti-oppression trainings, white supremacy trainings that I had to do in the environmental movement the last little while. So I've been focusing on trying to figure out ways that we can do that moving forward. So I think when we're thinking about what is art, I think for me that really means about reimagining even what it means to be a human. Like when I walked through the tar sands and heard those cannons firing, it was what does it mean to be a human myself, that this is where we've reached at that point. And so I think, the last thing I would say would be to just, it's a question of how are we going to recenter the movement in the UK, given that there's this question of urgency and crisis, but it's leaving behind the people who are most impacted in London, across the UK as well, because we face environmental pollution the most as well in the UK. So I think it's a pivotal time to have some of these sticky conversations, and how can we do them lovingly and also creatively as well, so that we're not recreating the same oppressions in the movements that are trying to save the planet.